My name is Natalie Rowan, and I was 31 years old when everything I thought was stable finally revealed how disposable it believed I was. For nearly a decade, I worked at NextCore Solutions, and if you searched the company website or investor decks, you wouldn't find my face anywhere. No spotlight interviews, no innovation awards, no rising star plaques mounted near the elevators. Yet if you unplugged me from the system, the company would have collapsed into a screaming pile of corrupted databases and angry enterprise clients within hours. I wasn't leadership. I wasn't management. I was the person in the server room at 2 a.m, making sure everything actually worked while other people slept comfortably knowing it would. I joined NextCore fresh out of college. Back then, it was a scrappy operation with fewer than 200 employees, duct tape systems, and leadership optimism doing most of the heavy lifting. The infrastructure was fragile, undocumented, and held together by hope. Over my first 18 months, I rebuilt the entire back end from scratch. Not flashy, not sexy, but resilient. Monitoring systems that caught failures before customers noticed, redundancies that made disasters boring, architecture decisions that no one applauded because nothing ever broke. That became my reputation. Reliable, quiet, invisible. By year 3, NextCore had stabilized enough to start attracting attention, and that was when I met Evan Caldwell, my boyfriend at the time. He worked in sales enablement for a regional consulting firm, charming, ambitious, and very aware of how things looked from the outside. He liked that I was steady, that I paid my bills, that I didn't panic. At first. Things changed slowly, almost politely. His friends started dating finance guys, investment analysts, people who talked loudly about bonuses and titles. Evan never said outright that I embarrassed him, but I felt it in the pauses, in the way he'd redirect conversations at parties, in how his mother suddenly had opinions about my career ceiling. Evan would laugh it off, but he never shut it down either. By year 7, NextCore went public. The executive team walked away with stock options worth millions. I got a branded paperweight and a 5% raise. The company newsletter called it a milestone for everyone. Evan forwarded me the article with a smile emoji, and later that night asked if I'd thought about what's next yet. His tone was casual. The implication wasn't. That same year, wedding planning began. Evan wanted an $80,000 ceremony at a hill country resort, 200 guests minimum, Instagram-ready moments. I wanted to not start our marriage in debt. Every time I pushed back, he framed it as fear, or lack of ambition, or me settling. His mother backed him relentlessly. Together, they formed this subtle, smiling pressure that made me feel like I was constantly apologizing for being practical. At work, I was still keeping everything alive. That's when Blake Harrington arrived, new Vice President of Technology Innovation. 32, MBA from Wharton, 3 times my salary. Blake had the dangerous kind of confidence that executives love, the kind that makes complex problems sound like branding opportunities. He spoke fluent leadership, knew which metrics mattered and which ones no one would ever verify. His first all-hands meeting was a masterclass in buzzwords: modernization, agility, eliminating legacy dependencies. Legacy dependencies was his polite way of describing the systems I had spent years building. He didn't come alone. He brought BJ, a walking resume experiment in a tight blazer and pristine sneakers, holding a laptop like it was holy scripture. Blake introduced him as if unveiling a product feature. BJ nodded at everything Blake said, even the jokes that landed like bricks. That meeting ended with applause. I sat there, hands folded, listening to people clap for the dismantling of everything that kept the company alive. And I knew, quietly, without panic, that something fundamental had shifted. Not yet broken, just fragile. Blake didn't waste time settling in. He moved through NextCore like someone who already believed the place belonged to him, reshaping conversations before he ever touched systems. Within his first week, he scheduled one-on-ones with engineers, product managers, directors, everyone except me. When my turn finally came, it felt less like a meeting and more like an inspection. He sat across from me in a glass-walled conference room, sleeves rolled just enough to signal productivity, eyes scanning my architecture diagrams as if they were written in a dead language. He smiled the whole time. "So," he said, tapping the table lightly, "what happens if you leave?" The question wasn't curious. It was diagnostic. I answered calmly. "Everything's documented. Runbooks, diagrams, escalation paths. Redundancy built into every critical layer." He nodded, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that." That became the pattern. Blake didn't attack directly. He redefined reality. In meetings, he reframed stability as stagnation, called safeguards over-engineering, spoke about cost efficiency like it was morality. When systems failed after his changes, he framed it as growing pains. When they didn't fail, he took credit for modernizing outcomes. His second week, he called an emergency meeting at 6 p.m. on a Friday, claimed he'd found critical security vulnerabilities in our authentication stack, and wanted to deploy patches immediately. I asked which vulnerabilities. He pulled up a report from an automated scanner. Half were false positives. The rest were configuration warnings, not threats. I explained that calmly. He overruled me. The patches broke single sign-on for 3 enterprise clients. I spent the entire weekend undoing his fixes while he attended a networking event downtown. Monday morning, he sent a company-wide email thanking the team for their rapid response. His name appeared in the signature block 3 times. Mine didn't appear at all. At home, Evan barely noticed. I told him I'd work through the weekend. He nodded, distracted, scrolling through his phone. Later that night, he mentioned one of his friends had just gotten promoted to director and joked about how some people just move faster. He didn't look at me when he said it. By May, Blake started cutting costs in ways that looked impressive on spreadsheets and terrifying in practice. He renegotiated our cloud hosting contract, removing redundancy buffers and failover capacity I'd built in over years. The CFO loved him, saved the company over $800,000 annually. What the CFO didn't see was fragility. Under load, systems failed. Predictably. Quietly at first. Each time, I restored the boring protections Blake had stripped away, undocumented, uncredited. Meanwhile, Blake's consultants billed $180 an hour, 6 of them 3 months straight, to recommend changes I'd implemented for free years earlier. That summer, smaller things began happening. Meetings without me, project channels I lost access to, my name missing from reviews. It was subtle enough that complaining would have made me sound paranoid, so I didn't complain. I documented. At home, wedding planning escalated. Evan showed me venues with deposits larger than my annual bonus. When I hesitated, he framed it as lack of commitment. His mother called after every disagreement, her concern wrapped in disappointment. "I just worry you're holding him back," she said once, gently. I started sleeping less. By late summer, Blake barely used my name. When he did, he said it wrong, flattened it, turned me into a ticket number. And every time something broke, every time a safeguard saved the system, every time NextCore stayed standing when it shouldn't have, I felt it. Not pride. Countdown. By June, it was no longer subtle. Blake's strategy shifted from reframing my work to pretending it didn't exist at all. Architecture discussions happened without me. Design reviews were scheduled during meetings I hadn't been invited to. Project updates referenced the team instead of individuals, a neat way of ensuring no one ever traced stability back to the same person it always had. When I finally confronted him, politely, professionally, he smiled like I'd just asked a naive question. "We're just trying to streamline communication," he said. "Less dependency on single points of failure." I understood then. I wasn't a risk because my systems were unstable. I was a risk because they worked without him. That summer, Blake introduced his proudest achievement yet: consultants. 6 of them. Senior. Expensive. Each one billed more per hour than I made in a day. Their mandate was modernization, which mostly meant removing guardrails they didn't understand and simplifying systems they hadn't lived with long enough to fear. Every week, something small broke. Every week, I fixed it. I stopped doing it publicly. Instead, I restored stability quietly and kept records. Commit logs, Slack messages, architecture diagrams, screenshots. I didn't know yet what I was preparing for, only that I'd learned not to trust narratives written by people who never checked the details. At home, the erasure followed a different shape. Evan started coming home later. Dinners turned into updates about his friends' successes, promotions, engagement rings, stock options. Every story landed with the same unspoken comparison. When I talked about work, he nodded absently, his attention already drifting to something more impressive. One night, after I suggested trimming the guest list to avoid debt, he sighed heavily. "You're always thinking small," he said. "That's why you're stuck." The words "stuck" settled into me like sediment. By August, NextCore's systems were fragile enough that I could feel failures coming before dashboards caught them. Load spikes, memory leaks, warnings that only mattered if you knew what to listen for. Procurement froze spending for 6 weeks due to budget realignment. During that freeze, I submitted 2 purchase requests for a diagnostic tool we needed to identify a growing database issue. Both were rejected. I warned Blake the problem would escalate. He told me to work around it. So I watched. I waited. And I felt the pressure building, technical and emotional. Like a storm, everyone else insisted was just bad weather. At home, Evan finalized deposits. Venue, catering, photographer. Tens of thousands of dollars moving without my signature, but not without my money. Every payment felt like another system losing redundancy. By late September, I was exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. I didn't know yet that the smallest number in the story, $220, was about to erase everything. The morning it happened felt ordinary, which in hindsight feels cruel. I was already at my desk when the first alert came in. Database latency creeping upward, connection pools misbehaving in a way that didn't trigger alarms yet, but absolutely would. I recognized the pattern immediately. A memory leak buried deep enough that guessing wouldn't fix it. We needed a proper diagnostic trace. The tool license cost $220. I submitted the request. Rejected. Again. Procurement was still frozen. Blake was in meetings all day. The warnings escalated. I could feel the system degrading, like a structure quietly cracking under weight no one else noticed. Waiting would mean guessing. Guessing meant risk. Risk meant outages, data corruption, client panic. So I made a decision. I bought the tool on my personal card, installed it, traced the issue in 90 minutes, fixed it before a single customer noticed. Then I submitted the expense report with full documentation, receipt, justification, outcome. That was my mistake. Not the purchase, the assumption. Blake appeared at my desk that afternoon with security behind him. BJ hovered nearby, clutching a manila folder like it contained state secrets. Blake's expression was performative disappointment, the kind executives practice in mirrors. "So," BJ said slowly, pointing at my expense report, "you bought software." I didn't answer. I didn't want to encourage him. BJ nodded gravely. "That's like technically fraud adjacent." Fraud adjacent. Over $220. I explained calmly that I'd prevented a database crash, that the consultants billed more than that per hour, that the system was stable because of the fix. Blake leaned in close, his smile gone. "You're a thief," he said quietly. "That's not worth clean money." I didn't argue. I just filed the sentence away, right next to every other quiet dismissal I'd swallowed over the years. "Noted," I said. He straightened, confused by my lack of reaction. Security escorted me out. Badge deactivated. 9 years revoked in seconds. I carried a plant and a box of desk supplies past people who wouldn't meet my eyes. Outside, the heat hit like a wall. I stood there holding the plant, feeling something evaporate. Not anger, not grief, certainty. I called Evan. He answered on the third ring, laughter in the background. Lunch with friends. I told him I'd been fired. The silence that followed wasn't concern. It was calculation. "You got fired over $200? He asked finally. I explained. He sighed. "So you broke policy and embarrassed yourself." The tone was familiar. The one he used when I questioned wedding costs. When I wasn't enough. "You're unemployed now," he continued. "Do you know how this looks?" There it was. Not "are you okay?" Just optics. By the time I hung up, I was no longer engaged. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. I didn't cry in the parking lot. I stood there with the plant tucked under my arm, watching cars move in and out like nothing had happened, like my entire adult life hadn't just been reduced to a cardboard box and a policy violation. When I finally sat in my car, my hands were steady. That scared me more than panic would have. Evan called back 10 minutes later. His voice had shifted, less performative now, more sharp. "I talked to my mom," he said. "She's concerned." Of course she was. "She says this kind of thing doesn't just happen," he continued. "People don't get fired unless there's a reason." I laughed once, short, empty. "There was a reason. I fixed their system." "You fixed it by breaking rules," he snapped. "Natalie, this is exactly what she warned me about. You don't think ahead. You don't play the game." I asked him, quietly, if he thought I was a thief. There was a pause. "That's not the point," he said. "The point is what people will think." That was the moment something in me shut off. Not anger, not heartbreak. Just the final click of a door I hadn't realized was still open. That evening, while Evan stayed at his mother's to cool off, I opened my laptop and started separating my life like a controlled demolition. New bank account, changed direct deposit, removed Evan as an authorized user on every card, canceled automatic payments tied to wedding vendors, froze my credit, changed passwords on everything we shared. I wasn't ruining his life. The next morning, I sent one email. Subject line, return of conditional property. The engagement ring. Tracked shipping. Signature required. No emotion. Just administration. Evan tried to turn it into a conversation. I kept it procedural. 2 days later, the ring arrived in a small padded box, like it was embarrassed to be there. That afternoon, I met my lawyer. He listened without interrupting while I explained the firing, the accusation, the years erased by one sentence. Then I opened the folder I'd been keeping, quietly, instinctively, for years. He leaned forward as he scrolled. "You built this framework independently," he said slowly, "and they've been using it commercially for 5 years." I nodded. "I never transferred ownership." He sat back. The air changed. "Then they didn't fire you over $220, he said. "They fired the owner of the system their entire company runs on." For the first time since the parking lot, I felt something solid settle in my chest. Not revenge. Leverage. We didn't raise our voices in that coffee shop. My lawyer, Mark, didn't need theatrics. He needed timestamps. I opened my laptop and laid everything out the way I always had. Folders nested inside folders, clean naming conventions, dates intact. The framework I'd built years before NextCore ever touched it. Public release logs, Git history, license headers, Slack messages where engineers casually referenced it handling production load beautifully, telemetry clauses buried in plain sight that allowed anonymized usage tracking for compliance. Mark's skepticism evaporated, one scroll at a time. "They're using this everywhere," he said quietly. "Billing, authentication, data pipelines." I nodded. 8 billion API calls a month. Conservatively. He exhaled and did the math out loud. Damages, exposure, injunction risk, rebuild timelines that would terrify any board. When he finally looked up, his expression wasn't excitement. It was respect. They thought firing you ended the problem, he said. It started it. The demand letter took a week to assemble. Surgical. No insults, no emotion, just history, law, numbers, and consequences. $4 million in licensing violations, 30 days, or federal court. While Mark prepared the filing, I slept. 9 uninterrupted hours the first night. No alerts, no dashboards, no responsibility for keeping someone else's business alive. In the morning, I separated my finances further, paid rent, covered legal retainers, watched my savings drop to numbers that would have scared me months ago, and didn't panic, because for the first time, fear wasn't doing the thinking. The demand letter went out Monday morning. By noon, NextCore's legal team had called 4 times. By Wednesday, denial arrived in an 8-page response full of confident nonsense about work-for-hire doctrine and company policy. Mark replied in 2 pages with copyright law, public timestamps, and federal precedents. They went quiet. That's when the systems started failing. Not because I touched anything, I hadn't, but because Blake's consultants kept stripping out safeguards they didn't understand. Outages followed, penalties, stock dips, internal panic. Engineers asking questions that led straight back to my documentation. Then the leaks started. An internal screenshot. A Slack post in the wrong channel. A $4.2 million number suddenly visible to hundreds of employees who knew exactly what it meant. By the end of the week, tech blogs were circling. Investors were asking questions leadership couldn't answer. Mark called me Friday night. "They're trying to rewrite your framework," he said. "Emergency project, 90-day deadline." For the first time, my certainty wavered. 90 days was possible. I stopped sleeping properly. Watched telemetry. Watched my leverage shrink as their replacement handled more load. Then, in week 3, it collapsed under full production traffic. 4-hour outage. Major client threatened termination. Contractors quit. Mark's call came before sunrise. "They're done," he said. "Settlement talks start tomorrow." I slept 8 hours that night. Settlement talks didn't begin with numbers. They began with silence. NextCore's outside counsel stopped posturing. The confident tone drained out of their emails, replaced with careful phrasing and delayed replies. When Mark finally got them on a call, there were too many people on the line. Legal, finance, someone from the board who didn't bother introducing themselves. That alone told me everything. Behind the scenes, the company was unraveling. The failed rewrite had done more than crash systems. It shattered a myth Blake had built, that anyone could replace caretakers with innovators and nothing would be lost. Engineers started quitting. Quietly at first, then in clusters. Exit interviews mentioned burnout, instability, and leadership that didn't listen. Tech blogs picked it up. Internal exodus at NextCore amid infrastructure crisis. The stock dipped again. Then the board asked the question that mattered. Whose decision was it to fire her? Blake tried to deflect, claimed policy, claimed process, claimed he'd inherited problems. The board chair cut him off and asked if he'd known my framework powered most of the company. Blake hesitated. That pause cost him everything. By the end of that week, he was placed on administrative leave. No announcement, no praise, just gone. A press release followed days later, citing strategic realignment of technology leadership. No severance beyond the minimum. I was hiking when Mark texted me the update. I stopped on the trail, reread it twice, then kept walking. Meanwhile, my personal life tried one last time to claw its way back. Evan called. Voicemails at first. Apologies wrapped in regret and panic. The venue had kept the deposit. His mother was furious. Credit cards were maxed. Plans had collapsed without my funding. He talked about mistakes, about stress, about how we could reset. I deleted them without listening. My mother tried a different angle. Group texts, family pressure, accusations of selfishness. That didn't land either. Someone in the family finally asked, why I was expected to go into debt for a wedding after losing my job.
The silence that followed was loud.
Settlement negotiations dragged for days. NextCore tried to structure payments creatively. Consulting fees, NDAs, support clauses. Mark shut them down one by one. "You owe her for what you used," he said, not for her silence. On November 5th, the wire was initiated. The waiting nearly broke me. Savings dwindled. Legal fees stacked. Rent cleared with less comfort than confidence. I'd been strong for weeks, but strength doesn't pay bills. When the bank notification finally came, deposit cleared, I stared at the screen for a full minute before moving.
$4 million.
Clean money. I didn't celebrate. I breathed. The confirmation email arrived at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Wire received. Funds fully cleared. I didn't move at first. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just stared at the number long enough to make sure my brain wasn't filling in a fantasy where a zero didn't belong. I called the bank's fraud department myself, had them confirm the source, the clearance, the irreversibility. When they finished, they flagged the transaction as verified and legitimate. Only then did I exhale. I called Mark. He didn't congratulate me. He said, "I'll release escrow," and sent the final documents. Both parties signed. Matter closed. No ND as gagging the truth. No consulting leash disguised as cooperation. Just payment for what had been used without permission. That afternoon, I printed 2 documents. The $220 expense report Blake had called theft. The wire confirmation that proved its value. I framed them side by side and set them on my desk. Not as trophies, as receipts. I paid my taxes first. Over $1 million gone in one transfer. It hurt, but it was honest hurt. Clean hurt. I paid off everything with my name on it. Rent, legal fees, lingering obligations I'd carried like background noise for years. When the dust settled, I had enough left to build something that didn't require anyone's permission. Evan tried again. New numbers. Long voicemails about regret, about pressure, about how he'd let his mother get in his head. I deleted them without listening and changed my number 2 weeks later. My mother sent a message through a cousin saying she was proud of me, that she wanted to reconnect. I told my cousin I appreciated the sentiment and needed space indefinitely. Some bridges don't burn. They just quietly stop existing. Within 2 weeks, I filed paperwork for CoreFlow Solutions, LLC. Hired 2 engineers I'd known for years. Brilliant, overlooked, tired of being invisible. I paid them better than NextCore ever paid me. We worked calmly, carefully, with respect baked into the structure. NextCore became a client in January. They hired a new CTO. She was competent. She emailed questions instead of making declarations. Invoices were paid on time. The licensing agreement was clean. $600,000 annually. Consulting billed separately when they needed help beyond basics. The company that fired me over $220 now paid me 6 figures a year to keep their systems alive.
Same code. Different respect.
Blake resurfaced months later with a LinkedIn message about potential collaboration. I left it unread. Later, I heard he'd applied to several companies where I had contacts. When asked for references, I confirmed employment dates and declined to elaborate. That was enough. One afternoon, a young engineer named Kyle called me, voice shaking. He said he'd been fired for buying a monitoring tool. $180. He'd read my story online and wanted to know if I'd been scared. No, I told him. I was tired of being scared. There's a difference. Kyle works for me now. Getting fired wasn't the best thing that happened because of the money. It was the best thing because it forced me to stop undervaluing myself. To stop letting people define my worth by titles, optics, or how quietly I kept disasters from happening. Some people keep awards. I keep proof.